welcome to a special on-location bookmark with Father Robert Barron, talking about Word on Fire, his media and teaching apostolate. Welcome, Father Barron.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Actually, you should welcome me, because this is actually the set for the wrap.
This is my set.
For Catholicism, and you were nice enough to let me stop by and get to talk to you a little bit about your media apostolate.
Terrific, yeah, thank you.
Now, you were on with Father Mitch on talking about Catholicism, and then we had a very nice series of wraps that you taped on this particular set, so we can get specific introductions for the 6 episodes that we're running here on EWTN. In fact, in another week or so, since we're right now in Advent, we're going to be running some more of the episodes this month in December. Let me ask you about that.
Yeah.
There's the Catholicism, there's a book, and then there's the media series that's 10 parts, right? Okay, now we're running 6. A lot of people know about it from the public television airing of 4.
Right.
Okay, let's talk about why didn't they end up running all 10?
Well, we brought the 10 episodes to WTTW, which is the public television station in Chicago, and to my delight, they said, yeah, we'd love to play this.
So were you surprised that they even considered it?
Yeah, I must say I was. You know, we didn't really make it for public television. We just made it because we thought it was a good thing to make. And we brought it down there, and yeah, I must say I was surprised, but delightedly so. They said, well, yeah, we think it would work for Catholics, but also for non-Catholics or any religious seeker. So I said, great. And they said they wouldn't do the 10 because it was just too much time. Okay. And they typically would take a package around that length. So they said, could we choose 4? And I said, yeah, fine. And they said,
so it started out really being based on availability or a typical series for them.
Yeah, that's right. And they wanted the ones they thought would have the broadest appeal. And they chose, again, I was delighted with this, the first episode on Jesus, who is Jesus Christ, which ends with a call to acknowledge Jesus Christ as Lord. So I was happy that they chose that one. The second one they chose was the one on God, where I look into God's existence, obviously of interest now with all the atheist critiques. It looks into the question of God and suffering, God and evil, all that. They also chose Mary, and he said, well, we want something that was very distinctively Catholic. I said, okay. And then they chose the episode on Peter and Paul and the missionary outreach. This friend of mine, kind of a wag, said, well, they're PBS. Of course, they chose Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Oh, I get it. Okay.
But, I was pleased they chose those 4. So we have an agreement that they have exclusive rights to those for 2 years.
Okay.
And so the remaining 6 then
are the ones that you made available to EWTN.
That's right.
And we're great to have them. And let me ask you that too, because you actually mentioned PBS.
Yeah.
Now, we know when we were promoting the episodes, and we'd like to say that's the 6 episodes that public television didn't make available to you for whatever reason, like you just explained why. Yeah. But it sounded good when we said it. These are the ones they didn't show you. Yeah. The idea of differentiating between PBS and public television. There seemed to be a little bit of a pushback about a month or so ago. Was there some concern in understanding the differentiation between those 2 terms for some of the stations out there?
I think it was just a difference between, let's say, a PBS made and sponsored series and a series like ours that was syndicated to PBS stations individually, and about 100 of them picked them up. So it's just that difference.
And it's not like WTTW produced this series with you and it became a PBS series.
That's right. They picked it up and they syndicated it, and then I was delighted that 100 stations picked it up around the country. So that's
how many stations are there actually? Do you know if the top?
I don't know precisely.
So what percentage might have been?
It was a very high percentage. I'm not sure exactly how many there are, but it's coast to coast, north to south.
And let me ask you, now that it's been running over the last couple of months or so, right, we're in December, so did it start in October or was it November?
Right. I think the very first one was in September in Baltimore and Washington. Yeah.
Okay, so the last couple of months, what kind of feedback have you been getting?
Good. Both the personal feedback by email and letter and phone call to me, but then the stations have reported very good ratings around the country. So we were just thrilled with that. So and very little pushback. I mean, I was expecting much more, frankly. That this Catholic show and this is public television, a little bit, but very little comparatively. I think people just they're thrilled with the quality of it. It looks like a very professional level documentary, and then I think they're just intrigued by knowing more about the Catholic Church. So I've been delightfully surprised by the lack of pushback.
Right. Have you ever had the feeling sometimes that there's a lot of fallen away Catholics out there who, though they don't agree with the way the church is, and when they're with their friends, they're maybe not too happy about the situation of the church's teaching on birth control and things like those kind of things, or the pedophile scandal, obviously. But at the same time, there's this subliminal pride in the faith.
Yes.
Whether it's something that's just a hereditary thing in their life.
Yeah. No, quite right. And they say, you know, the second largest religion in America are ex-Catholics, which I think is true statistically. So I always had them in mind as a target audience. I think of like maybe the tightest circle would be Catholics themselves and want to reinvigorate their faith. The next circle out of ex-Catholics. You know, a lot of the mega churches, certainly in Chicago, but elsewhere too, are filled with ex-Catholics.
Sure.
That to me is a tragedy. I mean, I want to find
you saw a lot
people,
of that as a fallout from the charismatic renewal too.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, that's right. But I want those people, and I think you say it just right, to be just intrigued by the beauty, by the art, the architecture, the great texture of Catholicism that would appeal to something very deep in them, even if they have opted out of the church, you know, in some official way. But still, there's a Catholic soul that I'm trying to appeal to.
Do you ever have somebody come to you, like sometimes people go to us and say, well, you're just preaching to the choir. And we like to say, well, have you seen the choir lately?
That's right.
And if everybody believed what we were teaching, the church teaches here on the network, there would be a lot more people at Sunday Mass than there might be, or living out their faith. On the other side, do you get people who say, well, Father Barron, I like you, you seem pretty orthodox, but you're a little out there sometime. You mentioned Bob Dylan, you throw out these cultural kind of things, or you're pandering. That they get you on the other side, as opposed to the idea of saying that there really is a multiplicity of ways of reaching people, right?
You know, and I go with the church fathers. I mean, so the use of Bob Dylan is in its own way, like Augustine's use of Plato. You know, I mean, they looked for what they call the logoi spermatikoi, the seeds of the word. So they looked into the philosophical culture, they looked into the literary culture and said, well, that reminds us of the fullness of the Logos in Jesus. And I love that part of the Catholic sensibility. We opt against a sectarianism that says Jesus and then everything else. Jesus good, everything else bad. No, the Catholic genius is to say, no, Jesus, fullness of the Logos, and then look at that Logos, and look at that one there, and look at that one. So I think, of course, you know, as Augustine looked out to Plato, he didn't embrace everything in Plato. He disagreed with a lot of it. Thomas Aquinas didn't agree with everything in Aristotle, but by God, he used him and said, well, there's a Logos spermatikos I can use. So I think, you know, now, mutatis mutandis, someone like Bob Dylan or someone in the popular culture, you say, well, no, there's something in that song that is very resonant with the Catholic sensibility. Does that mean you endorse everything Bob Dylan ever said? Of course not. But I think that's part of the Catholic genius, is that we're willing to do that.
Well, do you think that sometimes that's a reaction to maybe some excesses that happened, let's say in the 60s and 70s, where people did go too far in embracing these things?
Yeah, I mean, because I grew up with what I call beige Catholicism, so I know all about that, which is a kind of just watering down of the faith and everyone's saying the same thing deep down. That's the wrong way to play it. The right way is to begin with Jesus Christ, to see the fullness of truth there. But then, Thomas Aquinas talked about manuductio, a leading by the hand. Why did he use philosophy? He said, not because I need it. There's the fullness of truth in Revelation, but I can use it to lead people by the hand who aren't ready for revelation. But maybe Aristotle will help them. So I think for evangelical purposes, we can and should do that. We're not watering down the faith. We're, as Thomas said, I'm not diluting the wine into water. I'm turning the water into wine.
Well, it's like our Holy Father talks about the court of the Gentiles, especially in Europe, reaching out.
Quite right. Yeah, and of course John Paul II knew that in his bones. I mean, how to do it. So I think that's a good Catholic
well, I have to mention, you're throwing around all these terms. You're obviously a well-spoken television host, but you're obviously not just a television host. You're a priest. When did you first think you were called to the priesthood?
As a little kid, I was interested in it. As a little tiny kid, I was sort of fascinated by church and by the priest, and you know, like a lot of kids, I would play Mass when I was a little guy. So it was always there in the back of my mind. But then it faded away. I wanted to be a Chicago Cubs shortstop.
Okay, Father Mitch wanted to be a cowboy, so you wanted to be.
I wanted to be a baseball player for many years, and of course, being a Cub fan, you learn a lot about suffering and.
I was going to say, so that prepared you for the priesthood.
It did in many ways
in the church, right?
So that was.
But is it redemptive suffering? That's the question.
That's the question. I don't think it is. It's pure suffering. But so I wanted to be a baseball player. Then I wanted to be a lawyer and a politician when I was a high school kid. And then it was later in my high school years I began thinking much more deeply about the priesthood. But the breakthrough was when I was a freshman in high school. A young Dominican friar at Fenwick High School outside Chicago taught us one of the arguments for God's existence in Thomas Aquinas. And I'd grown up as a Catholic, kid, went to Mass and all that. But I never realized you could think deeply about the faith, that it had something intellectually compelling. And it was like a compulsion almost to study that more, to understand it. And I'm 14, 15 years old, and I'm reading Aquinas, or trying to. But that lit a fire in me. It was like a spark. And that eventually grew, I think, into the flame, of the vocation.
Mm-hmm. And Word on Fire is a book we talked about in the past, and also the name of your ministry. Why did you pick Word on Fire? You just mentioned, you kind of alluded to that in a sense. Right there.
I've always loved the scripture passage from the Lord saying, I've come to light a fire on the earth. I love the sort of multivalent quality of that it's something to shed light. It's also dangerous. It's also thrilling. I've come to light a fire. The drama of evangelization. And so we were knocking around possibilities of how do you say that in a pithy way. And actually it was my good friend and assistant, Father Steve Gruno, who said, Word on Fire. And we were with a good friend of ours, Father Paul Murray, who is a Dominican spiritual teacher and a great poet. And he said, you won't do better than that. So we said, okay, that's it, Word on Fire. But it was born of I've come to light a fire on the earth.
Well, let me ask you, you went into the priesthood, and then what, you were teaching for a period of time in the seminary? Or?
Well, no, I was first in a parish. I was 3 years at a parish in Park Ridge, Illinois, which is outside Chicago. And I was very joyfully engaged in that work. And then the Cardinal Bernardin asked me to go for studies. And I went to Paris, to the Institut Catholique, and studied systematic theology. And I wrote on Thomas Aquinas and creation. Then I came back in 1992 and began teaching at the seminary. But I had a little bit of pastoral work before that.
Well, let me ask you, you haven't mentioned anything that has anything directly to do with media. How did you make that transition? What was the first time you realized, or someone came to you and said, you should be recording this, or you should be taping this, or more people need to hear?
I can tell you exactly. It was, maybe 12 years ago now. I was out with a good friend of mine, a Chicago priest who had done some media work himself, and we were at lunch, and I was complaining, as was my wont, about media. And I said, we Catholics are so behind the curve. Protestants have done so much better than we have with radio and TV, and what about the new media now and podcasting, and why aren't we in the game? And Fulton J. Sheen was the great model, but then we haven't followed up. So I was going on and on. And he looked at me finally and said, well, what are you doing about it? And I said, well, what can I do about it? He said, well, then stop complaining about it. So that got into my craw, I must admit. And I knew he was right, So that's when I went to WGN Radio, which is the biggest radio station in Chicago. I just said, just tell me for fun, how much would it cost, and could I get on with a sermon show? They said, well, we have a very good time at 5:15 Sunday morning. And for 15 minutes, I said, okay, how much would that cost? And they said, $50,000. And so I went back to my parish where I was helping out, and I told them that story. I said, I'd like to try this. It'll cost me $50,000. Could you give that to me? And they did. That's how it got started.
Really?
Yeah, and
so a lot of early risers there in Chicago.
Well, it's funny, the number of people, the number of letters and emails I got.
Was that in the morning or in the evening?
In the morning.
In the morning. That's what I figured. With the religious ghetto usually is, right? Okay.
Yeah, it was just before the Lutheran hour. I was just 15 minutes before.
When I started in radio 30 years ago, I used to play the record with the Lutheran hour on it.
Is that right?
Sunday mornings, yeah.
Yeah, I was right before Lutheran hour.
Right. Yeah.
But the number of truckers going through the Chicago area and listening, to me at 5:15. But then we branched out to Relevant Radio, which is the bigger Catholic radio network. And then the website, we started developing that to house the sermons. I began podcasting before I knew what podcasting was. But so why don't you try this podcasting? And then about a week later, I read an article that said, Father Robert Barron, the leading podcasting priest in America. I didn't even know what it was. But I was doing it. That's how we got started. Right. And then the next major moment, though, was Cardinal George, who took me aside at the seminary one day, and he said, I want to talk to you about evangelization. He said, you're going around the country, you're giving talks, you're writing books.
So were you getting a lot of that because of the media that you were doing?
Yeah, but also I was just...
Or were you just out doing that?
I was on the speaker circuit.
Okay.
There are a lot of priests who is lectures and retreats and workshops and all that.
But more parish-oriented or more organizational kind of things?
Yeah, all of the above. Priest groups and retreats. And so I was doing that, traveling around a lot. Okay. He said, you're writing, you're traveling around, but I want you to jumpstart evangelization. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, I don't know, but I want you to do it. And so that was an impetus to go into it more fully. He said, I want to take you away from the seminary, at least full-time, and then get into this work. So that's how I was drawn into it,
right.
kind of gradually.
So you started with that. How did you first get in? Because one of the things you've got, I know about 10 books or so.
Yeah.
Obviously, Catholicism being one of them, and a couple others here on the Eucharist. And there's a bunch of DVDs, some of which we've shown here on EWTN.
Yeah.
How did you go about first getting these? And was this your first real entry into television?
Into video, yeah. That was going back to 2005. And a good friend of mine had a connection in Cincinnati with a production company, and he said, why don't we try to just tape some of the retreats you've been doing over the years? So it's material I knew very well. And we gathered a great group of people from many different parishes in Chicago who had some connection to me up at the seminary, and we set the room up with a couple cameras, and we taped this retreat. And that's the one that EWTN first showed, the Untold Blessing. I did several more after that. And that was my first foray into the video side of things.
Right. So how did you you were doing that, you're preaching, you're doing the radio thing.
Right.
Now somehow you were on WGN television for a period of time too, right?
Yeah, that was just last year. We bought some time on WGN TV, but all during this period, I was dreaming about the project.
Okay. So now we're back to Catholic. Now we're up to where Catholicism comes in.
Right, because I had this charge now from Cardinal George, and I was doing this work. I thought, well, let's do it in a big way. I'm kind of the Chicago adage about make no small plans. I like that. I like make big plans. So I had a big idea, and the idea was to do something like Kenneth Clark's Civilization, the program that I loved when I was a kid in the 70s. Where Clark went around and showed Western civilization. He talked about it, but he showed it in the churches, cathedrals, museums, etc. I thought, why not do that for Catholicism? Show the beauty and talk about the truth of it. So one day at the board meeting for Word on Fire, a nice board of very supportive people, and I laid out the idea. A board member said to me, well, you should drop everything else you're doing and do that. That's what you should do.
Really? Okay.
And I said, yeah, I mean, great if I could, but first of all, I don't know if the Cardinal would let me. I have to take time off and travel the world for 2 years. They said, we'll find out. So 5 members of the board went down to see Cardinal George. And they said he walked in the room. They gave him some preliminary material. He walked in the room and said, whatever I have to do to make this happen, I will do. So I had the Cardinal's permission. I had the board's encouragement. Now I had to raise $3 million. So that was the next step. And
was that easier than getting the Cardinal's permission? Or?
No, the Cardinal's permission came pretty easily.
That was pretty easy.
But we did it, and even though the economy collapsed halfway through our fundraising, so we started 2000.
Well, let me ask you this question, because that's always the big thing. You alluded earlier to Protestants doing. And there's a lot of economic reasons why Protestant ministries can raise a lot of money because of the megachurch concept and things like that.
Yeah.
Catholic entities have always traditionally had a lot of trouble raising money for media projects.
This. Right.
How did you succeed?
I don't know. God's grace, I think, was the main thing. But I think this project appealed to people, maybe because it was a big, bold plan, but also because it was being proposed during the darkest period in American Catholic Church history. And everyone knows that. And I would say it explicitly. I would just say, we're passing through the most difficult time in the history of the American Catholic Church. What do? We go to a defensive crouch. We could listen to all of our critics. We could give up. Or I suggested we could do what a lot of the great saints have done. During times of crisis, you come forward with a kind of back to basics evangelicalism. I mean, you know about it here at EWTN, the same thing, is what are we about as a church? We're about Jesus Christ, we're about the saints, we're about the Eucharist, we're about the sacraments, and to seize that and to present it in a compelling way. So when I would go to the fundraising meetings, I would say just that. I would tell that story. And I think it appealed to Catholics who were feeling a bit beleaguered, a bit beat up. And I also would say, think of this the way maybe your parents and grandparents thought about a parish or a hospital or a school. So Catholics would invest a lot of money in the great institutions to which people came and they were evangelized. I said, now they're not coming the same way to our institutions. We need them, obviously, but they're not coming the same way. We've got to get them.
We've got to reach them.
We got to get them. So think of this project, I said, as the way your grandfather thought about a parish or a school. And you're investing in that because I hope it has a long-term evangelical effect. So I think that appealed to people, and that's how the money came in.
Well, let me ask you this, because there's been some other projects that have been out there, and at different times people have raised money. And then they go out and they do the project, and the project can sometimes be very, very nice and good, but doesn't necessarily raise a lot of money, pay itself back. And then people look and say, oh, I guess this wasn't a success. I'm not always sure that that's the right measurement of what's a
right.
success or not.
Yeah.
You know, in the sense of reaching people and changing hearts and turning people around is what it's really supposed to be all about, not ROI. But that being said, how are you doing with this, and do you see this as something that will succeed well enough for you to go to the next level?
Yeah, so far so good. Okay. I don't know all the exact figures, but actually I learned that little phrase you just used, ROI, at one of our board meetings. One of our businessmen said, well, what's the ROI? And I turned and I said, what's ROI? You know, so I learned what the return on investment, for those who don't know.
Right.
Yeah, for us, the return on investment, of course, is the salvation of people's souls. I mean, that's what you want. Right. But having said that, you also want to have some solvency where you can continue. Right. And yeah, so far so good. I mean, it's selling well around the country. And yeah, my hope is that that will simply be turned back into another project. And yeah, I'm very pleased so far with the way it's selling, and I hope it keeps going.
Well, let me ask you, do you have an idea of what that next project might be, or is it in the early stages? Is it something you can talk about on the program?
Yeah, kind of early stages, but we're hoping to get back on television. You mentioned WGN, and last year I was on the WGN Superstation, which goes all over the country. I was on Sunday morning at a good time, not 5:15. It was about 9:30 or 10, I think. And I was on for a half hour with playing some of the DVDs you'd mentioned, you know, older material. What I want to do is do a whole new set of shows where I would preach. I think I'm at my best when I'm in front of an audience. Most Catholic priests are. I mean, it's when you have an audience. Doing the series was more like movie acting. You know, there's the camera and the lights, and you're set up.
People don't realize that you're doing it, and you're doing a setup, and you're waiting for it to do, and then you do those lines, and then you may have to do them again.
And now it's the fourth time. Where, you know, I'm much more natural. Most priests are when you have an audience and people there, a congregation, you're speaking. So I'd love to gather a good group of people and have a good Catholic evangelical preaching that brings the wealth of our tradition, the wealth of our theology and spirituality to it. And get that on, I don't know if WGN, but some national venue.
Right.
So that's our hope for the next, maybe the next year.
Why do you think preaching? I mean, you feel that's your strong point? Yeah. That's what's not out there? Why?
Well, I just think, look how successful so many Protestants have been. You know, that drawing huge audiences, drawing huge TV audiences with preaching. I don't think people have heard Catholic preaching that often. They hear Protestant preaching, which has a lot of virtues. But I think, you know, the pioneer again was Fulton J. Sheen, who basically preached or lectured, you know, for that half hour. But Catholic preaching has its own feel, as you know, and it's informed by so much theology, spirituality, intelligence, art, etc. I want people to hear that. I also want people to know that Catholics are deeply biblical. People have the impression sometimes that, well, Catholics, you know, we're not biblical people, we're theology people or something. No, the Bible is the soul of theology. I'd love people to hear, and again, I'm thinking of the guy sitting in his hotel room, maybe going through the cable and stumbling across the show. I always had that person in mind. And to hear some good, substantive Catholic preaching, I think would be a great thing.
Now, let me ask you, when you do that kind of thing, what kind of prep do you have to do? Are you assuming you have these homilies that you've got sitting in your computer and you're just going to pull those out like you did on your retreats and you just videotaped them?
Maybe.
Or would you see yourself writing them? When you write something like that, since you're an author, how long does it take you to put something like that together?
Sermons are different for me. I don't usually write them out word for word. I write out pretty elaborate notes. I'm with Fulton Sheen, you know, who he came to Mundelein. I got this from an older Chicago priest. Fulton Sheen himself came to Mundelein in the 50s. And he said, I write out my sermon word for word, but then I memorize it and I throw the paper away, because why should I, made in the image and likeness of God, be held captive to a piece of paper? And so this priest said, we were all so impressed by that. So I craft the homily through notes, and then I more or less commit it to memory. And I talk it out loud. So I'll rehearse it by talking it. People walking by the window might think I'm mad, but I'm just talking the homily out. So I probably would do something like that. These would be expanded versions, maybe 20 minutes or 25 minutes. And I would like to do something really new. I've written a lot. I've done a book of homilies. But I'd like this to be something new. I went on a retreat just about 2 weeks ago with that in mind, to kind of think through and pray through what I should do for these topics. But that's my usual method with preaching.
Well, let me ask you, since we're wrapping up time-wise here, and Catholicism is the major import for us at this point in time, let me ask you, in reviewing the series, Is there anything you wish you had been able to do that you didn't do in the series, or you wish had come out better?
I don't know. It was based upon these 10 scripts I put together that I hope would really be covering the essential elements of Catholicism. And then we plotted the trips based on that. I'm trying to think if there were trips that we weren't able to make. I mean, I wasn't able personally to get to the Philippines and Brazil. We sent a film crew. I love the third world side of it. I mean, I got to Calcutta, I got to Uganda. I would love to have gone to the Philippines. I'd love to have gone to Brazil. I got to Mexico City. My own background is, more American, and I was trained in Europe, and I've taught in Rome. So I love showing that other side of the church. So I guess I'd say that. I wish I'd made it to the Philippines and to Brazil to see that firsthand. The other one we dreamed about was going to that little island off of China where Francis Xavier came at the end of his life, was about to go into China, died there. I wanted, because I'm very interested in getting this message into China. And that's one place I wanted to film. We couldn't.
Well, hopefully through EWTN, Catholicism is getting to those places.
And I'm thrilled about that.
And we're happy about that. And maybe in your next project, you'll actually go and visit those places.
I'd love to.
Great to have you.
Great being with you,
here.
Doug. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your series, Father Robert Barron, Word on Fire Media and Teaching Apostolate. Catholicism is the series. You can watch the 6 episodes right here on EWTN. Join us next time on Doug Keck.